Hello, welcome to Global Connections. I'm David Lanoue, Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hawaii Pacific University, and I'm filling in for Carlos Juarez, your usual host. One of the great things about HPU is all the outstanding teachers and scholars that we have whose works are well known and whose students greatly appreciate what they do. But what many people here in the community and our students don't know is what kind of interesting backstories many of our faculty have. And I have a faculty member here today, Assistant Professor Dr. Brian Price of the Department of History at HPU. Dr. Price got his bachelor's degree in political science from UCLA and his PhD in military history from the University of North Texas. But it turns out he has a really fascinating life history before that. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that, and we'll talk about some of the things that he did with the U.S. military in Afghanistan. But first, I want to welcome Dr. Brian Price. Brian,
Thank you, David.
welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So tell us how how you came to become a historian. There were many stops along the way, weren't there?
Yeah, I actually started out kind of in your field. I'm going into political science, was interested in international relations. Had my eyes sort of set on going to fly Navy jets, but this was in 1990 when the budgets were cut. So not having that opportunity, because the budgets were cut, I decided to go into the internet industry. And I did that from 93 all the way up to 2001. But while I did that, I sort of maintained an abiding interest in sort of ancient medieval culture. And so I read widely on that, as well as reading on military history and sort of modern military operations. So once the internet sort of first wave crash sort of happened in 2001, I left the industry and then started a publishing company that I ran until 2011. So I did that and then produced 26 books while we did that. And then also, starting in 2006, decided to pursue my doctorate as my final career.
Okay, and you also worked in prop making
for
Hollywood.
I did. While I was going to school at UCLA, rather than work at McDonald's or something else, I ran a prop shop. We worked on films as big as Abyss, the big two-hulled ship on the surface, did that, and some of the work on Little Geek, the ROV underwater. It's a good experience.
Get to interact with all the famous Hollywood stars?
No, all the famous production assistants and whatnot, so yes.
And you would think that that's plenty for a pre-career career. But in addition to that, you also worked in the Human Terrain program with the U.S. Army. Tell us how you started there.
Yeah, I was finishing up my degree and was all set to go teach, but budget cuts hit there too, so they said there would be a delay. And while I was poking around on a board, an information board, there was an announcement from BAE Systems looking for social scientists to serve in Afghanistan. I'd never heard of the Human Terrain System, had no idea what it was, and yet I had every single thing that they were asking for, apart from the fact that I considered myself a humanities person, not a social scientist. So I applied at about 2:30 in the morning, and shortly thereafter I had a call, when can you start? So
it's an hour and a half later.
Very, very fast,
Wow.
Yes. And 10 days later, I was at Fort Leavenworth getting trained.
Wow.
It was,
That must have been a whirlwind.
It was brisk, and there were some crisp discussions at home as to how we would deal with the business and everything else.
Right.
But my spouse basically said, if you want to go, let's do it.
So tell us what the Human Terrain program was.
It was a system that came about as part of Petraeus's surge strategy into Afghanistan and Iraq. And it was designed because brigade commanders had done some studies and realized that they didn't really have a good grip on the socio-cultural kind of complexity in these societies that they were supposed to be working in. And in a counterinsurgency environment, that's the whole point, is to compete for legitimacy with the insurgents. Right. So without knowing what those past histories are and the dynamics of the society, it became very difficult to craft counterinsurgency strategies that made sense. So the Human Terrain System was spun up to help bring in an academic outside perspective that would sit in on the military staffs, represent that point of view of the Afghan and the Afghan people, more specifically, not the government, into the brigade operation, so they'd have a window as to what people are thinking and feeling.
So you were not actually part of the Army, but you were...
Correct. I was a DoD civilian.
Right.
So we were not contractors, but we were part of the DoD, got essentially most of the benefits of the uniformed guys, not all of them, but most, and served right shoulder to shoulder with Afghans on one hand, Shana Bashana, as they'd say in Pashto, and then with Afghan, American, French, some Italian, and miscellaneous special operators.
Did you carry a weapon?
I did carry a weapon, and I was of two minds about that. One of which is you're trying to conduct research, and it seems a little odd. On the flip side, some of the areas were quite dangerous, and so that made sense. But also, I did a lot of research on the ANSF, the Afghan National Security Forces, and it's got its roots in a warrior culture, and it seemed to actually benefit the combatants I was talking to, that I was also speaking to them on a similar plane.
Right. And what kind of training did you get for this?
It's 5.5 months of training, and there's some good and bad in there, but essentially they taught us two sides. One, how to run how staff worked and how we're expected to fit into that staff. And then secondly, how to do field operations, patrols and whatnot, so you knew what to expect when you went down there. And mostly that was good. And it improved several times since 2006. I started in January of 2011, so they had 5 years experience under their belt, setting up and refining the training. It wasn't perfect, but it was sort of the best they could cobble together at the time.
So what was an average day like in Afghanistan, or was there an average day?
Yeah, really there's no such thing. But every third day, roughly, I'd go out. And so on those days, you'd do the mission planning the night before. And sometimes the mission planning would come from the provisional reconstruction team or the command element or something else that was going on. And if there was an opportunity to talk to local Afghans, that's what I was mostly interested in. So we'd go out, and I and my teams that I was running would go out and sit with a patrol. The patrol would leave the base, and then you'd go out and pick a target, and then you'd go out and talk to as many people as you could and come back in. And it varied wildly what it was like depending upon where we were. And I served in RC East, which is Regional Command East, right on the zone where the Pakistan border is, of course, the sort of hottest zone.
Right.
So some areas there were very sort of almost peaceful, and some were contested.
So this was actually a dangerous assignment at times.
In some places, about half my deployment was, I would consider, dangerous. The other half was risky maybe, but not dangerous. Certainly there were always rockets and mortars and things bouncing around, but after a while, I'm not sure that was more dangerous than driving to Walmart. But outside, certainly, outside the wire, that could get contentious sometimes. We were in firefights a few times.
And so you were in the eastern Afghanistan the entire time?
Eastern, yeah, I was in a province called Kapisa, which is just northeast of Bagram, about 40 miles, just over one small hill or one small mountain chain. And then I was in Ghazni in the second half, Ghazni properly pronounced, and that was risky because the Hezb Islami, the Party of Islam, was down there, and the Taliban were in strong force down there, and they knew that we were leaving at that point. So they were competing, Padshaghardi is the Pashto word for it, to see who could actually sort of make the biggest statement against the guys that are leaving.
Right.
To get political credibility on the way out.
So what was the worst, scariest situation you were in over there?
Well, there were a couple times when we were doing long foot patrols, and we were hit repeated times on the way back, because we were supposed to walk back to the small combat outpost, a COP. And they hit us pretty hard a couple times. We didn't lose anybody, fortunately, but these were determined, sometimes non-Afghan assaults. So you could, people in the villages really didn't want any part of this. This was clearly coming from outside. And so I was really concerned, because we're there to do the, if not do the best good, at least do the least harm to people in the area. So we tried to, I think both the Taliban and the US was trying to keep the combat out of the villages and just work outside. So when you'd leave a village, that was when you'd get concerned and start to look around.
And when you were in the village, what sorts of things did you look for? Who did you speak to?
Right. Well, a number of people. Sometimes you'd go into a shura, which many people did this, and what the Army calls a shura, sort of a gathering or a meeting, a small, sit around in a circle, and they talk about the main issues. Afghanistan, at least in RC East, was very democratic in that everyone around the shura usually spoke and had something to say, but then a consensus would be reached, and that's how local governance seems to work there. But as you'd go outside of that, sometimes you'd get information there, and I'd speak there, and other times I was just watching body language and such. And other times I would go out into the village and just talk to the people who would talk to us. Now, it's self-sorting, you have selection bias and all of that. That is a problem, but the idea is just to get the best possible information to reduce the conflict on both sides. Some people would argue it's sort of, soft imperialism, but we really didn't look at it that way. We were really trying to prevent needless violence.
And what was the best information? When did you know you really had something that would help your folks with the military, but also help the folks on the ground in Afghanistan?
Well, there are always a bunch of needs that the locals have, and they can come up with a shopping list that's very long, and that can get very tedious. But when they start to talk about, a lot of people would go in there and ask, well, how's security in your village? And they didn't really know how to answer that. So I developed a different technique. I went in and said, well, tell me about the history of your village since the time the Soviets were here. And so they would speak about that, and they would tell me about the people who fought the Soviets and how the Soviets interacted, and all the way up through the Taliban era, and then up to the modern day. So we got a very good compact picture of what that little region looked like. And I think that does help both, because it's all about understanding more than tactics or anything of that sort.
Now, your training is in history,
Your
graduate training.
Yeah.
How does that graduate training help you over there?
Well, rather than, I suppose I could have used an anthropological sort of approach, but in a history context, we never have complete data. So we're always working with an incomplete set, which is exactly what you get in a conflict environment. So the idea is to take a historical methodology, which is to look for themes in the interviews that we have. And I used an oral history technique because that way people would be inclined to simply talk about their past, and then I could piece together and follow up from that. So it's more of a, anthropologists would call it a depth interview, but in our case, the person would actually have the rights to their own interview, and just like a historian would run it. So I actually sort of pioneered a lot of those things in Afghanistan and was bringing them into the human terrain system as an additional tool in their toolbox.
Great, great. And did you record those?
Only if there was agreement with the person, the source. If I didn't believe that they actually understood what I was asking, or that it was going to make them uncomfortable, then I wouldn't do it. So in some cases, yes, but only the recorder was always right there on the table, because I felt very strongly that we're not intelligence people, we're not going to hide anything, so everything needs to be above board.
And did the people, the civilians there, understand your role as being separate from the military, or they see you as one of?
Yeah, I'm sure that's blended. In one village we went into, I asked, big American flag on the shoulder, and asked them what nation they thought we were from. They said, "You're Russians," because nobody had been there. So it was just us. The last contact they had apparently was Russians, or at least that was the local folklore. But I think much of the time I would actually hand out cards and say, I'm, an academic, I'm working with the military, but I'm not military. The trick was to make it clear that I wasn't an intelligence type person. We didn't view our work as intelligence work. But I'm not sure that the way we think about this has much to do with how people in the villages really thought about it. The Taliban and the Hezbollah Islami fighters, yes, they were well tuned to what our doctrine was and what our structure was. And so if someone had a lot of information about that, then you began to wonder, maybe they have some affiliation. But that wasn't my game. I wasn't dealing with insurgents. I was dealing with the villagers, what we call the green or the white layers, not the red layers.
Right, right. And how were you, how did people react to you? Were they forthcoming? And I imagine different people in different ways.
In different areas.
Right, right.
But there's a spectrum. You could be surrounded by a whole group of kids and people who are overjoyed to see you, trying to get your pen and your candy and all that. And that was fine, although you're a little concerned about the weapons security and such. But I don't want to interview kids because I don't want to put them at all at risk in any way, shape, or form. They can't really give informed consent. So, but they were pleasant just to interact with on a social basis. But then people would come out, and some people we wouldn't see them, so they obviously didn't interact at all. We don't know that self-sort, so we don't know what they had to say and so on. Some people, though, would come up and want to speak with you. Sometimes they would want to talk about their neighbor that they disliked or something. But more often, people would pull me into their kalat, their walled house, because everybody lives in a walled sort of environment. And once they got inside the walls, what they told me was very, very different. Then they said almost every time, please don't leave. The people that you're here to fight, they're right here in the village. I'm not going to say who they are necessarily, but they're right here, and as soon as you leave, then they have the power. So I heard that even in very contested places where we knew the Taliban had sovereignty in the village. So there's a saying, Quran and Kalishnikov. So at one side they're speaking about the Quran, but if you don't go with a peaceful agreement, then they could be somewhat brutal sometimes. And at least that was a perception of the villagers.
Well, this is fascinating, Brian. Would you hang on for
Sure.
a slight break here? We'll talk again.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back with Global Connections and our guest, Dr. Brian Price, in just a moment. Please stay with us.
This is Alice Lee Hagan, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance, Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Hi, I'm your host on ThinkTech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, ThinkTech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Welcome back to Global Connections. I'm David Lanoue, and I'm here with Dr. Brian Price of the HPU Department of History. And Dr. Price has been telling us about his experience in the Human Terrain program that the U.S. Army put together, bringing in social scientists to help them in Afghanistan. And one thing I think really needs to be pointed out, we talked a little bit about it before the first break, this was not a danger-free program. In fact, this program lost, I believe, 3 social scientists during their time in Afghanistan. So, so Dr. Price, certainly, you were in a danger zone and certainly an admirable situation in that regard. Tell us a little bit about what your experience in Afghanistan tells you about how the outlook is. I mean, based on your time there, do you think that it's going to move in the right direction, that it's going to end up the way that I think everybody hoped it would when all of this began, right, or is it going to revert?
Well, that's a really good question. Afghanistan, of course, has a history of having a sort of a less centralized government than was put in with the Bonn Conference. I spent a lot of time with the Afghan National Security Forces, particularly the Army. And the Army was pretty much universally respected, at least at the colonel level and down, in terms of respecting local customs on both sides. So the Hezbollah Islami fighters and the Taliban fighters seemed to respect them, as did the population. And in a lot of ways, they acted, or they could act, as a stabilizing force. So one of the things, if we can support them in maintaining that army at strength, then I think there's a chance for the stability to go. The Taliban has recently said that they're going to start their spring offensive coming up soon, but the new president is trying very, very hard to balance all of these factors. In Afghanistan, I think that'll depend on his ability to court the local powers, because there are several ethnicities. He's got to be very balanced about that. And if he's able to balance those things and he has the support of the army, then I think he has a chance of doing it. But of course, so much depends on what Pakistan does. Right, it's hard to call.
Did they use the same human terrain program in Iraq?
They did. I have no direct experience with it except from working with people who were in that program. And in fact, although the first pilot was in Afghanistan, they populated the program heavily in Iraq first. And it ran there very strongly and apparently successfully until roughly 2011-12, depending upon when they started winding down in Iraq.
And do you think the program was successful in Afghanistan?
I would say it had a mixed record for a variety of reasons. I think it did do what the program was trying to do, maybe not the way they thought it would do it. But there were 2 things. One, I think we did develop the sort of sociocultural knowledge depending upon what the team looked like, because every team had different kinds of social scientists, different areas of expertise, different ability to get out and contact the population, different governance in every province and district. And depending upon how that looked, they were successful. There have been a number of interviews with brigade commanders, though, where they were very happy to have this sort of capability, local capability. And there's a second piece that we had, which was, in addition to that sociocultural stuff, we were also looking at the staff process and looking at it from an outside point of view once the courses of action were developed to say, well, here's what I think you're missing, and here's what I think the second order or third effects will add. So usually we were working at a reasonably high level with deputy commanders and commanders and giving them sort of an outside perspective on their military plans. And I think that was very successful.
What things do you think could have been improved?
Right. Well, I think the selection process, finding the right kind of people to send into the thing was the primary thing. Early on, they chose a lot of anthropologists, and this became quite controversial. I think that some anthropologists have the right kind of, because it's a bridging function. You have to not only interact with the Afghan culture, but also with the military culture.
Right,
and that's a complex thing, I think. So you need people who are adaptable, I think, and who understand and are willing to protect the local population, but also balance that alongside with what the mission is, because the brigade didn't pick the mission. They had just simply have to do it with the best tools possible. And this doesn't mean running over the local population or the local government. It means trying to interface in a harmonious way.
So if you were selecting people for this program, and you're selecting academic scholars, what kind of scholars would you choose? Not just what field, but what sort of people, what sort of experiences?
I'd be pretty open in field, but I'd want people who had shown diversity in their experiences, shown that they can work with people all the way from people down at the line in the factory or whatever, all the way up to kind of a staff level operation, because you're dealing with both kinds of entities, with generals and with shop owners and farmers, all the way up the chain. Plus you're working with US or NATO troops, some of whom are riflemen and some of whom are, lieutenant colonels or colonels with master's degrees and PhDs. So I think you need a very widely ranging background.
Now, most of the people involved in this program, most of the social scientists like yourself, were not necessarily military veterans.
No, very few were.
So how did you find the reaction you got from not only the officers, but from the rank and file military personnel to you as kind of an outsider, as an academic? How did they react to you?
Well, some of that depends on, first impressions. So when you come up in your gear, is your gear not looking all over the place? Are you looking like you fit in?
Right.
Just like any other cultural milieu. I think that's important. And I focus very hard on that in training and such. Plus I have other experience in gear, so I was comfortable with the weaponry and with the other things. But more, they're cautious at first. Both the officers and the men are cautious at first for very different reasons. In my own team, they were wondering why a historian, what a historian who focused on medieval cultures in their doctoral work might possibly bring to the table. That was an issue that we got to deal with. But essentially, if you provide value very rapidly, that's how you earn your reputation within the group. So for the troops, that value is, hey, what do those black turbans mean? And not making something up, but finding out what that is, getting back to them, interfacing with them in a non-condescending way, sitting down, playing Call of Duty with them, whatever you need to do to make the connections. And the staff is the same way. You meet with all the members of the staff, you find out what they're doing, how you can help with what they're doing. If you make their life easier and bring value to the table, then you get accepted.
Is this a program you think that could be applied to other countries and other situations?
I've spoken in the UK on this before, and there were teams attached to other countries. My first team was a NATO team when I worked with the French, exercising some French language skills, and they made good use of it, although they had a varied experience. The one team they didn't like at all, and the next team they thought was okay, and then they liked our team quite a bit. So it depends on what the team members, it goes back to that selection, getting the right people in the job is key. So yeah, you do end up establishing those things across the thing, and there's been interest in Canada and the UK and France on similar sorts of things. Not as heavy a footprint as we went in with, because our teams had 7 to 9 people. I actually think that I sort of don't think that was maybe the best solution either, but, and I'm wondering whether a system was really the right way. Certainly if you got the right person next to the right commander, that was a great relationship, and the social scientists needed staff too. I needed people a research manager to dig into the database and upload those things. I needed terrain HTA assistants or analysts, we call them, to go out and conduct further interviews. So there is a team element to it, but I think we needed to look more carefully at what a good team really looked like, and then try to replicate that across the board. There just wasn't really time in 4.5 years to get that knowledge in-house, I think.
Now, you're aware, of course, that this program was very controversial.
Yes.
And I think the controversies came from 2 different places. One was the general question of bang for the buck.
Right.
Was this too expensive given the benefit?
Right.
So let's go ahead and try that one first.
Even Petraeus said that. And I mean, he was asked, what he thought of the human terrain program after the controversy we'll talk about. And he said, yeah, did it provide value? Absolutely. Was it worth the money? Not wholly convinced. And there were a number of things. I think there was a special software package that tried to put in, and I'm not sure that was a success. I think I would have probably put it on fewer people, and then emphasized what those people need to do the job from them, and let it go at there. Certainly the emphasis in training and stuff, that was all well spent, no question about it. But I think instead of 7 to 9, we could have done it with 3, 4, something like that. So we could have cut that right off the bat.
Right. The second objection, the American Anthropological Association actually came out against having their members, their academic anthropologists, participate in this program. Right. And many, as a result, did not. Some did. And their objection, it was actually, there were many parts of the objection, but let's go with one right now, which is that having academics attached to a military outfit puts all academic researchers at risk because now people in that country can't know whether they are working with somebody who is tied to the military or is an independent researcher.
Right. Well, that one was actually, I think, easier to deal with in some ways, because if you're accompanying a military patrol, then probably you're affiliated with the military. If you're out there on your own, none of our people worked sort of independently on their own. We always had security and whatnot. So that might have been a problem early on when we had our own contractors of security and such, but I think once we were DoD civilians, that was pretty much answered. There are other things they complained about, or challenged, which I think are valid objections. The biggest one being looking at not endangering the people you're working with. And that was a core concern of mine as well, because you're talking to someone, you don't want to put them in danger at all. And I think the fact is they're in danger where they are, as it is, and we're trying to reduce the danger, not increase it. So by talking to them, yes, there's some chance that somebody might come back later, but we took every effort to make sure that they weren't singled out. So we talked to everybody, which gave everybody a chance and also reduced the thing. I think their challenges in that regard were heartfelt, and I think, but I think backing off from the problem and not have anything to do with it was not the best solution. Would the Army actually have been better off without the sociocultural knowledge there? Would they have? No, because probably they would have injured more people who shouldn't have been injured. And so from that standpoint, I'd say no, even though the complaint was the U.S. being there, that's not a problem the brigade can answer. That's a larger, higher level problem.
And I think one of the things they said, kind of going on what you just said, is that they felt that either intentionally or inadvertently, the human terrain folks would be asked to do things that would help identify potential targets. Right. Did you ever feel in that situation?
No, I did feel that people would volunteer intelligence type information to us, but that wasn't why we were there, so we would decline it. That wasn't why we were there at all.
And you probably had to question the validity of it too.
Always, even if we were going to go down that line, there's an issue. But there are intelligence people whose job that is to follow that up. So in my units, when I was around there, we let the intelligence people do that job. We focused on the population and the governance structure, and I focused a lot on the population and the military and police structure to see how the cultural relationships were between those groups and between those groups and us. So there is a danger of that, I suppose. But as long as you maintain that, as a caution, and you're trying not to trigger things that'll pull that out, you don't have to accept intelligence information as a human terrain person. You don't have to query along those lines. The other thing they talked about was that the information we develop could be used to target stuff. I suppose that's true, but I never saw it happen. It was quite the other way. It was, these people are interested in engaging with the Afghan government. How can we get this village and this government official together? And we were supposed to, the policy when we were there was Afghanization, so we were supposed to let the Afghans do it. And many, many times our response was just to connect them back up to the government. So I think that was the emphasis.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. I want to follow up a little bit on this and then take you in a whole different direction right after the break here. This is Global Connections. Please stay with us.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show, at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday.
Hi, aloha. My name is Chris Leatham, and I host a show called The Economy and You. The show plays every Wednesday at noon, and on my show, I bring on guests who are interested or working in the technology space. And so I'd like you to come and watch the show and learn with me about all the sort of exciting things that we're doing in Hawaii to build and grow our economy ecosystem. So I'd like to say aloha, and I look forward to seeing you on the show. Thank you.
Welcome back to Global Connections. I'm here with HPU Assistant Professor of History, Dr. Brian Price. And we've been talking about his role in the Human Terrain Program in Afghanistan around 2011, 2012, was it, Brian?
2011, 2012, yes.
Let me ask you one final question about that.
Sure.
What did you get out of this? What did you get out of this, and how did it change you as a person and as a teacher?
Well, I was able to experience the complexities of what counterinsurgency warfare is really like from the very pointy end of the stick. I didn't go out on a lot of raids and such, but the problems of counterinsurgency are really not primarily military ones. They're primarily a blend of political and military. And you can read about that all you want, but it's very, very different when you're sitting in the staff sections. I was able to watch the video conferences all the way down from the CENTCOM commanders and the division commanders, theater commanders, all the way down to the squad leaders. So I got to see the war from the squad's point of view all the way up through the chain to the headquarters point of view, and I could not have replicated that any other way. Added to that, I met tons of Afghan people who were fascinating, developed some friendships with some people there who I'm sure they'll last a very long time. Traveling there might be an issue in the near future, but certainly you get a respect for the struggles that they've been dealing with since the time, at least 79, when the Soviets rolled through. They've had 35 years of warfare, more or less, incessantly since then. We've never experienced anything like that in the U.S.
Yeah, how do people handle that? That's
They just,
2 generations of nothing but
three.
war.
Yeah.
3, yeah.
They just endure, really. I asked one of my interpreters what he did when the Taliban came through. They were cobblers, and he showed me some pictures of some beautiful shoes, including high heels, custom high heels they made, which seems odd for Afghanistan, but they said they made a lot of them. They said the Taliban didn't want them making shoes. So I said, well, how did you survive? They said, oh, we drove to Pakistan, we got satellite TV units, smuggled them in and sold those. Like, that's safer than making shoes. So I said, yes, and I said, well, Taliban were supposed to be opposed to media. How did people, well, they put them on the roofs and they'd cover them with cloths, and then in the nighttime they'd pull them off, and it's like, wasn't that dangerous? Well, there's a block captain, and as long as he's taken care of, then usually they didn't come by and hassle you more than that. So the stories that you get, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of stories, probably thousands at this point, from Afghans from all over the place. Mujahideen, people who were fighting with the Soviets against the Mujahideen, took a lot of oral histories of officers and such, and some of previous Mujahideen fighters. And the stories are every bit as amazing as you might expect.
Last question before I change the topic.
Sure.
What's the one thing you'd like Americans who haven't been there to know about Afghanistan? What's the big misunderstanding that they have?
Well, there are a couple things going on. When we arrived there, Kabul was very small. It had been more or less shelled to pieces between the Hezbollah Islami and the Northern Alliance. And it's grown significantly. A lot of young Afghans want to sort of come forward and modernize. But the Afghans themselves are really not Taliban. There are Taliban in Afghanistan. but I think the Afghans are really struggling with that. Of course, there's support for them in some places, but they feel in some ways like they're a battleground. And I think that our presence there, although it knocked the Taliban out of power, in many, many places, people seem to like that. So I hope that the next phase of government for them is stronger. I'm glad that we've said we're going to, keep 10,000 troops there for a while to help them with the transition. And I think that if the support is there for the Afghan army, that they do have a chance.
Now, your dissertation at North Texas was on medieval martial arts.
Right.
Did that help you in any way in Afghanistan?
Weirdly, it did. Yeah, you wouldn't think that, but it did. This is why I believe in liberal arts education, because you never know when things are going to come up and be useful. In this context, there were two instances. One, I did a lot of studies on, or several studies on vendetta and cycles of violence around vendetta and judicial duels in Europe and things of that sort. And while those things don't go on in Europe anymore, a very similar system works amongst the Pashtuns with what they call Pashtunwali and their system of retribution and violence and so on. It's like, this is familiar. So the studies I had done, even though on an earlier period about how councils work to reduce the violence, actually played out and helped me at least see what the possible dynamics were. You can't compare apples and oranges, but it did sort of, I had seen the kind of dynamic, before, and so it was pretty helpful for that regard. The second piece, which is even less intuitive, is that one of the conducts was having trouble between the ethnicities, and I was speaking with the conduct commander around this, and we were talking about just martial skills in general, and he asked me if I could actually teach some martial skills to him and to his officers, and then his officers would teach the men. So we were doing that, and then it occurred to me that one of the ways we might actually soften the problems in the conduct was by holding a tournament with padded batons, but padded batons and helmets. So we sent to Pakistan, we got some of these, brought them over, and had 2 little tournaments in the conduct, and it did actually help the relations between the two. I never would have predicted that. It wasn't in my job description, but it was fun.
Oh, that's wonderful. So how did you get interested in medieval martial arts?
My 4th grade teacher said I should read Lloyd Alexander's Terran Wanderer books, which are about Welsh. I guess she surmised that I was Welsh by my last name. And I read those, and then I read The Hobbit immediately thereafter. From there, it was Lord of the Rings. And then from there, I went to wargaming, was heavily involved in that one, because I lived in Wisconsin, where there was a lot of wargaming going on at the time. But then I saw some people who were actually trying to exercise themselves in the park with the weapons and the armor, and decided rather than doing it on paper or with little counters, I could actually go out and do it. And so I took it up as a hobby and did it all through high school, college, and kind of now.
So what kind of, do you have chainmail and helmets?
We have every element of the historical armor. My first book was actually Techniques of Medieval Armor Reproduction. Sold like 27,000 copies. I would never have guessed that. I told them 500. But so I learned to make the armor, and then you wear the armor appropriate for the period you're trying to do. So typically that's 14th or 15th century European stuff, at the time of the 100 Years' War between England and France. And so it's the time when plate was taking the place of mail. And so a lot of it is a combination of plate and mail. So I have full plate harnesses, and I have everything in between pretty much.
Well, let me say first, as an academic, if you sold 27,000 copies of a book, I'm enormously jealous.
Yes.
Let me say, ask you secondly, so what was your dissertation about?
My dissertation looked at some of these fight books that have survived from the 14th and 15th centuries, and previous fencing historians that had looked at them had concluded that they were sort of collections of weird tricks. I looked at them and said, no, there's a system in this. It's not just tricks. But I was wondering what the common glue was in that, and I went back and looked at it, and it led all the way back, as much medieval philosophy does, to the ideas of Aristotle. And Aristotle talked about the idea of art. And art to Aristotle is learning the principles of a thing so that you can apply human creativity to solve new problems. And to me, when I then look back at the fighting treatises, and they always called them the art of this, the art of that, never the science of defense or something like that, that evoked all those key ideas. Wait, it's principles that they're teaching. And so you couldn't have a book that would be thick enough to cover all the circumstances, much like a doctrinal manual. You can't have something that covers every circumstance, but you can have some principles. And then using creativity and understanding, the exact same thing we're doing in Afghanistan, you could create a new solution on the fly that took into account the changing environment. And so it's all about adaptability, which I think is really what we're teaching people about at HPU.
Absolutely. So you made your own medieval weaponry and armor. Where did you find the materials for that? There's not a store, I assume.
Well, actually, for sheet steel there is. You can get it at the Metal Mart, for spring steel we get it in Chicago or a few other places. So you get the flat steel. I haven't gone to the degree of smelting the metal and forging it out. There are a couple guys in Europe who have done that. My belief was that most armorers didn't do that. They would get the metal from a different place and use it. So that's what I did too. The metal's pretty easy. The hard part's the research, because there aren't that many surviving harnesses. So when I was doing it actively, it was primarily buying very expensive armor books and reading everything you could about it, and then going to museums and handling it. Now the internet helps with that a bit, but handling it's still crucial, because it just feels different. Like any kind of sculpture, it feels different in your hand than the picture looks.
So, and pardon my ignorance here, is this in the form of jousts then that the conflict takes place?
There was some things, but
hand to
of
hand?
course, yeah, I have some horseback experience. The bulk of mine is on foot, because that's simply easier to arrange and cheaper and so on. Training the horse is a nightmare. There are some people who do it and are very good at it, and I participated in that. But here in Hawaii, especially, and in our sort of international organization, it's mostly foot combat, dealing with the sword in two hands, in one hand, spear, poleaxe, and then for and against a dagger. And that includes a lot of grappling, because combatants, they're not just bound to the weapon, and you have to be able to control the human body.
Right. So, now, I don't want to obviously compare this to the danger involved in Afghanistan.
Sure.
There's no comparison.
Sure.
But do people get hurt at this?
Bruises. There are a series of different groups. The largest group has been responsible for this since the 60s in the United States is the Society for Creative Anachronism. They fight with solid rattan and full armor, so bruising occasionally, and they've been very successful at that for a very long period of time. And there's some SCA here on the island as well. In Russia and in Eastern Europe, they do something called HMB, historical medieval battle or something of that sort, is how it translates out. They use rebated steel weapons, full contact, but they're trying to drive each other to the ground. They do have a significant number of injuries. I train my guys, we use some polyethylene and nylon weapons for most of the sparring, not all of it, but most, so you can hit full contact and not have severe injuries. And then I'll fight rebated steel against selected people who I know are going to be safe. And by safe, I don't mean tentative, but rather I know that their concern for me overwhelms their ego in the fight, and vice versa. That's the only way you can really do it. And it holds this whole chivalric medieval philosophy alongside of it. So historically, the knights had a great deal of concern for one another. It really wasn't about killing enemy knights or opponents. It was about defeating them and engaging them at the highest level possible. Modern tournaments do the same thing. You're trying to engage and demonstrate your prowess, and along with the rest of the chivalric virtues. So there's some danger, but the most I've gotten really is a broken finger. It's not a big deal.
Now, if somebody wants to get involved in this sort of thing, how would they go about doing that?
Well, it depends where they are, of course. Here in Hawaii, we have a meetup group for the School of St. George, Honolulu, and people find us that way. And internationally, you look up historical European martial arts on the internet, and you'll find the local groups, if there are any. Failing that, you can find a Society for Creative Anachronism group, SCA. Type in that plus medieval, and you'll pull it right up.
And finally, you're a military historian. So actually having been engaged in this, mock combat, but still,
Sure.
What has that told you about strategy and helped you kind of understand your field?
Yeah, a number of things. I think it's very tough to write about these things you can do it from a linguistic or philological point of view, that's fine, or from the perspective of literature. But I've always enjoyed the blended perspective, so I dig deeply into the original documents and try to do the original translations and whatnot, but then see if that actually matches up with the action that you do on the field. And I use it as a confirmation or a rejection of what my working theory might be. Well, it didn't seem to work that way. It sounded good, looked good in the picture, but we're obviously interpreting it wrong because it doesn't work. So it helps to bring that out. And in a broader sense, the feel of pressure and the feel of engagement and interaction between emotion and rationality, I think anybody that's been in a combat environment has that, and I've been able to get that from both of those things.
Well, Brian, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Dave.
And thank you for joining us. This is Global Connections. I am David Lanoue.